Well, thanks everybody for joining us here this afternoon. I know a number of people have flights to catch here before too long, so we'll try to be prompt on start time, and we've got a lot of information to cover. My name's Tim Brownlee. I'm the executive chairman for AHEC. I said executive chairman, I meant the industry chairman. Mike Snow will be speaking to us here in a moment, the executive director for AHEC, and he's got a lot of information that I'm sure you're very eager to hear. So before we turn things over to Mike, I just want to put a plug in and for everybody in the room to make it a priority for your organization to be involved with and to be a supporter for AHEC. We really depend on a high level of engagement from each one of the industry members in order to be able to do the work that's really important on behalf of the whole industry. So Mike will talk about that in a little bit as well. And then Rupert will be delivering some information to you about the updates on EUDR in the AHA program. So without any further explanation, I'll turn things over to Mike. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. For those of you that know, I tend to speak very quickly in normal circumstances, and I know several of you have come up and said that you're going to need to take off a little bit early to catch flights. So I'll try to get through as much as we can, but there's quite a bit of, quite a lot of things going on right now in the international market as well as in the domestic market. But before we start, I really want to reiterate something that Tim was talking about. At AHEC, we receive significant funding from the U.S. Department of Agriculture to carry out a number of programs I think many of you are aware of, including our response to the EU Deforestation Regulation, which has has been almost 3 years in the making and a couple of $1 million. The government doesn't just give that away. We need the industry to be involved and need to be behind it. And as you know, right now we're exporting of our grade lumber, we're exporting about half of it. So even if you're not involved in the export markets, if those export markets shrink, then all of that fiber that's going overseas is going to be competing in the markets here. And we can get additional money from the USDA. There is money out there, but we need to be able to leverage that money. We're not given a check at the beginning of the year. We have just over an $11 million budget this year. But what that does is that allows us to spend up to $11 million. But we have to outlay the money first, submit for reimbursement, and wait for reimbursement. And if we don't have enough cash flow to do that, we need to turn away money, and they'll give it to soybeans or cotton or whoever else. And we are, quite frankly, in a bit of a cash flow crunch right now. So those of you who don't participate, want to learn a little bit more, please come and talk to us afterwards. We're out there. But with that, as you can see, the little green at the top, that's what the industry is contributing to this money. The rest of those bars, that's money that's coming from the USDA. That's not sustainable. That's not sustainable. The USDA wants to see more involvement. If they're going to be giving us this money, they want to know that the industry is willing to step up as well. And quite frankly, right now we're not. So that's going to be the end of my little commercial. But it is pretty important because there's money out there to help us with this, the industry to promote exports, but not only promote exports. A lot of the things we develop, a lot of the tools that we have are perfectly, well suited to help in your marketing efforts here domestically as well. And if you haven't been on the AmericanHardwood.org website, please take a look or please come talk to us because we have a real opportunity moving forward to get actually even increased money depending on how the Farm Bill negotiations come out. But we do need industry support. So with that, for those of you who are in here for Andes, I just want to kind of set the stage on where the international markets are. And I'm going to talk about the export markets right now, where we are into this year, and then we're going to end with Rupert, who's our AHEC's Environmental Policy Director, is going to talk about the latest updates on EUDR and give you a little bit more information for those of you who haven't stopped by our booth on the American Hardwood Assured program that we're using as a mitigation tool to help you satisfy the EUDR requirements. But for those of you who weren't here for Andy's, and even if you were, I think it's worth reiterating a couple of the main points he made. So the first couple of slides I'm going to show you may look familiar, but I think it's really important to put this in context. As we noted before, the high point for production for this industry was 1999. And you see at the top there where we were in 1999, where we are now in production. It's not a pretty picture. It's below the 2008-2009 housing crisis. It's below where we were in the pandemic, and things are not moving in the right direction. You saw this slide earlier today. This is our domestic consumption over that time period. If you look back at 1999 at the high point, what we were spending on flooring, on millwork, on cabinets. I mean, we're talking furniture. We're talking about almost a 90% reduction in our domestic use, and a lot of that, yes, furniture's gone overseas. Wood furniture production, but also what we're seeing is other materials taking our market share. It's not just the manufacturing moving overseas, it's other materials taking ours as well. This one is perhaps the most depressing slide out of anything that we'll show. And this is, I think, is really, really important, because if you look at, the blue line is housing starts in the United States. The red line is consumption of hardwoods domestically in the United States. These two things correlate back, all the way back to World War II. As more houses were being built, more hardwoods are being used. If you've seen these last several years, we've seen a divergence of this now. And again, has to do with the fact that we're being substituted by other materials, and that's why promotion is going to be so important to the future of this industry. And this obviously has its impacts on the ground as well. Starting in 2023 in the FIA data, we actually now in the eastern hardwood forest, we actually have more mortality than harvest. That hasn't happened before, and that's not a great sign, and that's not, as those of you know, that's not really good either for the health of the forest. So there's a lot of implications. It's not just our industry. There are a lot of implications that reduced consumption and reduced use of our forest are going to have environmentally as well as on our businesses. And that's going to get worse. If we look now, we've got about, we've got close to 50% of our standing hardwood timber right now is aged 50 years and above. So over these next couple of decades, we're going to see an acceleration in the mortality rates in the forest. So again, increased consumption, increased utilization of the forest is going to lead to healthier forests, and right now we're failing that test. The one thing we saw that decline in the domestic consumption over the last couple of decades. The flip side of that is where we have seen growth has been in the export markets. We've seen continuous growth in the export markets over the past several decades, to the point now where, again, back in 1999, we were only exporting about 15% of our production. Now it's close to 50% of our production, and if you look at some of the top grades, it's more of some species, it's more than 50% of our production. The export markets are fundamental and will continue to be fundamental to the growth of this industry. And it makes sense. We too often we think of the exports as we're just chasing production. Furniture used to be made in Vermont, then it moved to the Carolinas, and now it moved to Taiwan, then it moved to. It's not just the production. It's the consumption overseas, and we look at what's going on. The rest of the world is evolving. We've got people entering the middle classes in places like China and places like India at astounding levels and astounding numbers. And one of the reasons we talk about China that we saw that tremendous growth from the early 2000s up until about 2018, it wasn't just that they were manufacturing things and sending them back. It was that the end consumption of the furniture, the end consumption of the doors, of the molding and millwork, that was taking place overseas. And that's what really helps the industry to grow. So, start with a little bit of good news. We are still the world's largest exporter of hardwood lumber. Thailand is just right on our heels, but again, Thailand, essentially, we're talking about one relatively low, I don't want to say low quality, but it's rubber wood. We have the variety of species that we are the ones we can really, feed into production and consumption around the world. But you'll notice that it's not just us. You notice the last couple of years, overall trade in hardwood lumber from all sources has declined. And again, that's because we are being substituted out by other materials. If we flip that on its side and look at who the world's largest importers of hardwood lumber are, it's very unbalanced. I mean, it's China. And look at what's been happening, and we'll see in a couple of minutes what's been happening in China in the last couple of years. The EU 27, excluding the UK. And if you take the US out of there, you've got Vietnam. And then look at the UK. The little UK is one of the top 4 markets around the world. In fact, almost as much, not quite, but almost as much to the UK as to the rest of the 27 nations of the European Union combined. It's an extremely, extremely important market. Let's talk a little bit about tariffs, and again, I almost hate to do this because whatever I say now, probably by the time we go to happy hour this afternoon will have changed. But just there's a couple of things in general. I mean, right now, fortunately, we're not seeing, as far as our exports, we're not seeing a lot of impediments put in place yet. Yes, China has a 10% tariff on us, but in November, if we don't reach an agreement, that could go as high as 125%. That is a scary prospect because, as I said, we still depend very much, even if the Chinese market is 2/3 smaller than it was 5 years ago, it is still our largest market. We're starting to see, in Canada, why are we tariffing? And we'll talk about that in a second. Why we're tariffing Canada, I have no idea. But we are really causing a lot of bad blood around the world. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that when I start looking at some individual markets. Now we have some of the things on imports, things made with our wood. As of now, of course, softwood lumber imports at 10%. Okay, that doesn't necessarily impact us all that much. Upholstered furniture, right now, why it's upholstered furniture, I'm not really sure. But even that's not a huge market for us because, again, that tends to be, the framing stock tends to be lower grade, tends to be a lot of other species. Nobody's importing walnut or white oak to make framing stock for upholstered furniture. But that doesn't mean to turn around tomorrow and then we have tariffs on imported wooden furniture. And that would be a game changer. And again, any day now we could see a tweet, it's not a tweet, it's we call it a truther, whatever it is, but we could see a tweet that comes out that changes that overnight. And again, that would change the entire paradigm for our export markets. And we can see, we know back from 2018, we know what happens when you start getting into tariff wars. If you look at that red peak there, that was China back in 2018. When the tariff wars first started, when we first started seeing that, we saw a tremendous drop-off. And one thing that we've learned over the years is that when countries and companies begin to change their inputs, they begin to change their supply chains, it's very, very difficult to get those supply chains back. This will give you another look at our exports to China. And that whole growth, beginning back in the early 2000s up to 2017, 2018, that peak, as I'd mentioned before, that peak was driven by consumption of the end products in China, not just the re-exports. During that whole 2010 to 2018, China's exports actually as a percentage of consumption were declining. It was the domestic consumption within China. And that's what we lost. And that, I think, has been extremely damaging to our industry. But I don't want to say that the decline to China is only because of tariffs. It's not just our decline. If you look at China's imports from the rest of the world, they're down considerably as well. We had back again, 2018, we had 30% market share of a much bigger market. Now we've got a 23%. Actually, I think it's even lower than that now. So of a much smaller market. So we're getting a smaller piece of a smaller pie. And again, that's not a recipe for success. But China has a lot of its own problems that's leading to their decline in consumption. It's not just from us. There's a housing crisis in China. The Chinese government has depended way too long on investments in infrastructure to drive GDP growth. There becomes a point where more highways and more airports and more bridges to nowhere, it might, in the short run, it might add to your GDP. It doesn't make your economy healthier in the future. We're also seeing China move away from the the privatization of businesses that led to so much of that growth in the early part of this millennium. And they're doubling down. Xi Jinping has shown that he's very willing to sacrifice economic growth for what he perceives as geopolitical advantage. So we're seeing, again, a concentration in China back into state-owned, these large, bloated, extremely inefficient state-owned enterprises. And they're the ones that are getting access to credit, and the private entities are being squeezed out of the Chinese market. And again, I know we've talked about it before, but you can't overlook the importance of demographic issues in China. China, beginning again about 3 years ago, has a declining economy. There's more deaths. The last 3 years there's been more deaths than births. Chinese women are not having children because of the one-child policy going back the last couple of decades. There are a lot more young men in China than young women, and the young women have decided they don't want to be mothers. And one thing that we know, historically, if you look at economic growth around the world, there is almost not a single case, and no case in a large economy, where the GDP of an economy grows at the same time its population is shrinking. We've seen what's happened to Japan over the last couple of decades, and that's exactly it. And with China, you've got that Japan situation, but really on steroids. And again, when we start talking about the impacts of tariffs, we learned a very valuable lesson back in 2018, and that is we need to be at the table. In 2018, 2019, and and that was just China, not even the rest of the world. When we start looking at Chinese retaliation and who it hurt, they came after agriculture. Well, that's us. And if you look back in 2018, just before, on the eve of the first tariff war, on a dollar basis, only soybeans was selling more agricultural products into China than the forest products industry. And hardwood lumber is about 80% of that green bar. Out of the 40-some billion dollars that were taken in tariffs in 2018, they simply turned around and 33 billion almost of that 40 billion was given back to essentially farmers as a handout. And if you look at this graph where we were in the forest products, second only to soybeans, yet when it came time for the relief funds to come in, here's where this is where the forest products industry was. We were essentially left off. And that's something that, again, working with Dana, the Hardwood Federation, with NHLA, all of you talking to your members of Congress, we need to make sure that doesn't happen again, because we will have retaliation. Our industry will feel pain. And the government needs to know that we are as important as the soybean industry. I mean, the Wisconsin Ginseng Association, or ginseng producers, got more relief funds than the whole entire forest products industry. That's something, again, that has to change. And I don't want to keep beating on this, but somebody's got to explain to me why in the world we would be tariffing, coming in from Canada. We look at our forest products trade or our hardwood lumber trade with Canada. We've had a consistent trade surplus over the years, and we're drawing bad blood right now in return. I'm not going to get into this yet, but this is our wood furniture imports. But again, I think we need to keep it in the back of our minds that we could very well see wood furniture imports be tariffed. And again, that could be extremely damaging to our ability to export the hardwood lumber in the first place. So let's take a look at where we are so far this year. Again, we're down. Globally, we're down again, and it's been a downward spiral for the last couple of years. There are some bright spots that I'll talk about, but essentially we're down, was it about 8%? On a volume basis, we're down about 8% from this same 7-month period from last year. We look at what our largest markets are. And again, China, of course, by far is the largest market still, even though it's 1/3 of what it was 6 years ago. If you look at, or 8, I guess, yeah, about 6 years ago. But look at the trend in China. And that trend is continuing. Then Vietnam, then Canada, Mexico, United Kingdom. Looking at that a different way, this is where our hardwood exports are going right now. Now, we're a little bit more balanced than we were in 2018 when China was about 50% of our exports. And again, when you look at that, you consider we're exporting half of our grade lumber production, and we were exporting half of that to China. That's 1 out of 4 grade lumber boards that we were producing was ending up in China. Clearly, that was a lot of eggs in one basket, and we've seen what happens there if there is a disturbance to that marketplace. This one we already saw. Where are we now in China so far? Again, last 4 years, first 7 months of the year, first 6 months of the year, again, steady declines, steady declines. The Chinese are actively seeking other sources. They are looking for other suppliers. They're looking that, the US, we don't want to do business. They don't want to do business with us. And again, that's very, very damaging because we have the supply, we have the resource, and we should be looking to expand that trade. If you look at individual species, also the importance of China really jumps out at you. I mean, look at our cherry. More than 90% of all cherry exports right now are going to China. It is really the only export market for cherry lumber. But half of our red oak. Yes, we're making great strides on red oak in places like Europe and places like Australia, even Japan now that, you couldn't give away red oak not too long ago. But again, the kind of volumes we're talking about pale in comparison to the kind of volumes that China was taking in at the peak of the trade. Vietnam remains a very vibrant one. We're seeing a lot of that re-export furniture industry that was 15, 16 years ago in China has moved to Vietnam. But Vietnam's not going to remain the low-cost producer of it. There's always going to be chasing the next China, the next Vietnam. Is it going to be Cambodia? Is it going to be Laos? So again, in these countries, it's really important, like the success we saw in China of promoting the domestic consumption of the product. We're starting to move and trying to move in that direction. The Vietnamese, we don't want them to just manufacture furniture and re-export it. We want them to consume those products as well, and that's a lot of what our policies or what our goals are in the promotional efforts that we do in places like Vietnam. It's not just to feed the re-export machine, but it's how do we get more consumption overseas of the end products. This one for me personally is probably the most depressing. We saw a big drop this year into Mexico. But if you look at Mexico's overall hardwood lumber imports for the year, they are up nearly 25% globally. Yet us, their biggest supplier, we're down. We're down. Brazil's hardwood lumber exports to Mexico this year are up 31%. Malaysia's are up 40%. And the European Union now, mostly beech, but some French oak as well, is up 130%. The Mexican industry is actively looking for alternatives to American suppliers, and that is horrible. Last week, I was in Mexico at the annual meeting of the Mexican Timber Importers Association. I've been attending this meeting for about 25 years. There are people there I consider very close friends. There's people there I have known for decades. And the fact that they're telling us they are actively looking to substitute other suppliers for American hardwoods is extremely disheartening, But at the end of the day, they're saying, you don't want to buy from us, we don't want to buy from you. And that's destructive. I mean, we share a huge border with Mexico, not to mention Canada. Those borders, I'm not talking immigration, I'm talking business-wise, putting up, well, I'm not going to get on it because I get myself too worked up, but we are defeating, we are defeating ourselves, and it's hurtful. It really is difficult to swallow. There are some bright spots. Japan, we're seeing an increase. A lot of that has to do with, yes, the Japanese yen has been weak for a long time. That's really hurt things over the last several years. We've seen drops. Now we've got a combination of not only the Japanese yen increasing in value relative to other currencies, but we're also seeing at the same time the US dollar decrease in value. So again, that's kind of opened up that Japanese market for us, but I said that's, it's got to be tempered with the fact that what's doing this is that now the dollar has declined precipitously. Yes, that does help as far as export pricing, but again, in the overall impacts, that's not necessarily a good thing. So yes, more sales to Japan is great. Japan is a high value market, so it's not just the volume, but it's a high value market. They're willing to pay more for quality, for high grades. It's an important market that needs to stay in the mix if we're going to be exporting all grades and everything that the forest produces. Australia, New Zealand, we saw last year a tremendous growth, particularly in Australia. It's slowing down this year. It's slowing down a little bit this year. And part of that was there was a lot in fourth quarter of last year was huge. So there was almost a stop in buying at the beginning of, this year. We're starting to see some tick back. Talking to Rod, who just came back, we expect to see a little bit of an uptake, but we should be pretty close to where we were last year. Again, a white oak market primarily, although we're starting to make some strides in red oak and a few other species. But again, the volumes we're talking about are nothing compared to what we have lost in some of our major markets. This is just Australia itself, and you can kind of take a look. It is, primarily, I don't have my glasses with me. It is primarily a white oak market, but again, it's a high value market. Middle East and Pakistan. Again, the Middle East has always been sort of a mixed bag. It's not a uniform. There are some places in the Middle East that are, tourism and services bound, places like Qatar, places like Dubai, and then you've got the petrol states. And usually when one's up, the other's down, so it sort of balances over the years. But we're starting to see, again, we've seen a little bit of an uptick in Dubai, but Pakistan has almost doubled. The second largest market in the Middle East has almost doubled this year compared to last year. So again, if we're going to move forward, a lot of these smaller, yes, the volumes we're talking about are not huge, but we need to replace the large volumes to the one market we had with a lot of smaller guys. And it's going to take a lot more work and a lot more legwork, but we need to find more and new markets. Places like Algeria has a significant furniture industry. Places like Morocco has a significant furniture industry. Egypt has a significant furniture industry. Yes, none of them are going to bring in the volumes of a Vietnam or a China, but you take them together and we can start to see things tick up. And that's what we need to focus more and more of our attention. India is an interesting one. We're seeing great start to the year. The first quarter of this year to India was gangbusters. It almost doubled. We've seen a slowdown in the second half, in the second quarter into India, and it happened to coincide with the time that we announced we're going to be putting 50% tariffs on all exports coming out of India. At the same time we saw that, we saw Indian imports of American hardwoods, correlating almost directly with that. We're starting to see them drop off. And again, we don't want them to substitute out our material for somebody else's, because as we've seen in China and elsewhere, it's going to be very difficult to claw those markets back. And India remains an important market. It's about the 5th or 6th leading importer of hardwood lumber in the world. It's a significant market, yet we've got a tiny share of that. If there's room for growth anywhere, it's India. You look where we fit in. The United Kingdom exports more hardwood lumber to India than the United States does. And that's all one species, willow, for cricket bats. So there's clearly room for improvement there, and we need to spend more time and we need to hit the ground there, but we need to keep those trade relations open. And India is going to remain important, not only that, but also because unlike China, where we're seeing the demographics working against it, the Indian economy keeps growing, and it's actually larger than China now, and it continues to increase that lead over China. That could be a significant consumption market, along the same lines as we saw in China not too long ago. This is a market that we need to be in. This is a market that we need to expand, and it's a market that we need to also promote domestic consumption, not just the re-export industry. Europe has been good. Actually, we've seen an increase in Europe for the beginning of this year. But as I mentioned before, in the blue down there, it's obviously not part of the European Union anymore. But the growth we've seen to Europe for the beginning of the year is almost entirely accounted for by growth to the UK. A couple of other positive trends. Here you see the UK, where it stands compared to the others. We think of the Italian furniture industry, the Spanish door industry, and really no huge industrial production of those types of materials in the UK. So it's really rather astonishing that we see this kind of growth and this kind of consumption in the UK. But again, Europe in general, it's been almost exclusive, not exclusively, but it's been dominated by white oak. But we're starting to see changes in that. We're starting to see other other things, particularly red oak. We've seen now the last couple of years, you go back 10 years and you wouldn't even have seen red oak on this little blip in here. So we're starting to see those changes, and that's been David and his group. We've spent a lot of our time and energy telling Europe that, red oak is not just white oak's ugly stepsister. It's its own species that can be used. If you're not making wine barrels, it can be used for pretty much anything. And architects and designers are starting to get that message. Here we see the red oak, and again, Italy, we're starting to see Italy now, again, leading that, and that's really important because when you start talking about design, particularly in the furniture industry, it is the Italian designers, the Italian industry, that really is seen as global leaders. So again, if Italy starts to use this, if we start to see more and more acceptance of red oak, that's gonna help us to make up for some of the volumes that we've lost elsewhere in Europe. And I'm going to end up this portion talking really about log exports. There's been a lot of talk about it. It's difficult for me to take any kind of position. Obviously, we receive money from the U.S. Department of Agriculture for ag exports. Logs are an agricultural export, in USDA's eyes. And where we are is we don't do a lot to overtly promote the exports of logs. Obviously, if we're promoting the species, there's going to be a knockdown effect. But we also can't say we don't want to export logs because, again, we depend on the USDA, and at the end of the day, the landowner is going to have, really has the right to sell to whoever's going to give him the most. But I think that where we are is probably a pretty good spot because I get nasty emails continuously from log exporters that we don't do enough to help them. And at the same time, I get criticized from the lumber industry because we have people in AHEC booths overseas that are selling logs. So I figure if both sides are pissed at us, we're probably in the sweet spot. And that's something that we're going to have to pretty much stay there, I think. But the changes in there, historically, the logs, our export logs, other than, relatively small volumes of veneer logs that went into Europe and also into Japan, essentially our exports of logs were were really two places, Canada and China. Vietnam starting to come on, and then in March of this year, when the Chinese said, nope, we're going to completely ban the import of hardwood logs and softwood logs from the United States, boy, did we see a change. And again, you can see this is interesting because you can sort of see the cyclical nature of those log exports. And look at what happened in March of this year when China went on, where we had everything going to China, nothing to Vietnam. We've seen a complete switch in that. But what's happening is that the Vietnamese and even the Chinese are increasing their sawmill capacity in Vietnam. And they are re-exporting that lumber. And this next slide, again, we start talking about scary slides. This is Vietnam's exports of tempered hardwoods. So these HS codes, this is not tropical. These HS codes are US hardwood species. Look at Vietnam's exports of hardwood lumber in July. $30 million in 1 month from Vietnam to China. In that same time period, we exported, what, 39 million? So almost as much as us in that 1 month period, and that's increasing. But worse than that, we're starting to see Vietnamese, Chinese owned often, but Vietnamese sawn American hardwood lumber competing with us in places like India, in places like the Middle East. So we're now in a situation where we're actually competing with our own resource in export markets. So to leave you on that high note, we want to, with the balance of this, as all of you know, the EUDR, we're really confident there's going to be another year delay. But I think it's important when we look at it. People look at the EUDR, oh, we want to stop it, we want to stop it. I don't think we do. I think the EUDR can be a great boost for us. We have what they're looking for. We have a resource that doesn't come from deforested land. We have a resource that's legal. We have a resource that's sustainable. Anything that's done to keep non-sustainable materials out of the market can be a huge boon for us. So we've gone into this on a positive note. We want to find a way that we can work with the EUDR that's going to benefit us and actually is going to give us a leg up against much of our competition overseas. And I think we've really sort of hit on it. And those of you who haven't come by our booth, I know we're running out of time to do so, but we have a really innovative program. And again, a program that was made possible by by funding from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, funding that, again, we have to be able to leverage with industry participation. I'm going to let Rupert talk about a little bit about that program, a little bit about where things stand in the EUDR, because it is moving quickly, and we are seeing, I think, a real possibility of an opening for U.S. hardwoods to increase sales, not just into Europe, but around the world, based on the EUDR. Because remember, Europe is only about 13 or 14% of our direct exports, but the EUDR is also relevant for any wood products made elsewhere. So wood furniture made in Vietnam that ends up in Europe has to abide by EUDR regulations. Wood, furniture made in China, furniture made in India, furniture made in all of these other countries. So it's not just our exports to the EU that are at risk if we don't find a solution to the EUDR. It's a lot of our exports to these other places because, when you start looking at trade flows, countries and companies that are making furniture that are selling it around the world, they don't want a two-tier system. If this is required, for Europe, for one of the biggest end consumption markets in the world, this is what they're going to want. So if we're going to be in a situation where we can supply, which we know we can supply the world's furniture and wood products industry with high quality material, we need to find a solution to this. And I think we're close, and I'm going to let Rupert take over.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I think first, just to elaborate a little bit on where the political situation is in the EU might be quite useful, because you've probably all heard that the EUDR itself is likely to be delayed. That hasn't been agreed yet. There is a proposal that has been put forward by the European Environment Commissioner, which makes it very likely that it will be agreed, but it still needs to be formally approved by the European Commission, the European Council and the European Parliament. And that is not necessarily totally assured. That it is possible that it will not, the delay will not be pushed through. But the expectation is it will, partly because the excuse that the European Commission has given, the information system is not up to scratch. The latest information we've heard is in negotiations in the European Parliament. It seems like a legitimate problem. They cannot implement and roll out their information system in time by the end of this year in a way that will work. I think we could have all told them that this is likely to happen 3 years ago, because we all knew that they were asking a huge amount, billions and billions of data points required from a very complicated set of commodities. So we did expect that this might happen, but it has happened. But behind that as well is also some very significant internal political disputes. The EU, in their wisdom, have managed actually to set basically the whole of the EU forestry sector against this law. They are generally very resistant to it, because this law, although obviously agricultural land conversion worldwide, that is the main cause of deforestation worldwide, this law actually falls much more heavily on the forest products sector worldwide, and including within the EU. The big question they're looking at the moment inside the EU, at a political level, it's all been negotiated at a very high political level, is essentially whether they simply delay the law for 12 months or whether they delay it with amendments. Now, that is quite an opportunity for all of us. If there is amendment, it could work very much in our favor. There is a risk, again, that these amendments will not work in our favor, because there's quite a lot of pressure inside the EU to turn this law into even more protectionist measure than it already is, by introducing actually removing all requirements inside the EU trade for doing anything, including the passage of geolocation data through the internal market. That could possibly be one outcome, and the raising of greater barriers at the borders. Another proposal that they're all talking about at the moment is that they introduce a so-called zero risk category. Of course, the expectation is that the US should be recognized as a zero risk country, but that again is not assured. So we feel that we need to demonstrate that we have a system that operates. We don't actually care whether the US is zero risk or not. We can demonstrate that our sector is zero risk using the program which I'm going to explain to you and demonstrate a little bit, the AHA, the American Hardwood Assured Program. All the details of that program, if you're not already familiar, it's at our website, www.hardwood.us. A lot of detail. That website, even if you did look at it a couple of months ago, that website was updated only a couple of days ago with a lot of new information explaining exactly how the system works, a lot of background data, a lot more on the methodology, and it really does explain why this system, I think it's probably the best due diligence assurance system anywhere in the world, because we have much better data we can actually quantify to a very accurate degree the extent of risk. We can quantify the risk, and we can cover all the legality issues covered in EUDR much more effectively, I think, than any other program. So there is an opportunity here, I think. Another part of this opportunity is offered by the recent negotiations, actually, between the EU and the US on this broader trade agreement. Again, you're probably familiar, 21st of August this year, this joint statement on a United States-EU framework agreement was issued. And this joint statement includes a very explicit commitment on the part of the EU to work with the US to reduce or eliminate non-tariff trade barriers and to enhance opportunities for technical cooperation on standards development, of which things like timber procurement policy, timber regulation, that should be part of that technical cooperation. And very specifically on EUDR, the EU, actually, the European Commission, and this is quite unusual, the European Commission in this agreement has acknowledged that the US is a negligible risk, which is actually, they haven't done that for any other country. All other countries are labeled low risk. The US is actually negligible risk. That is acknowledged now in an international trade agreement. And they've also said that the EUDR, they will work to ensure that EUDR does not impose any undue impact on US-EU trade. So that's a real positive we got out of those negotiations. We have an opportunity to really influence now the content of perhaps the law itself, but certainly of the guidance. Another part of this opportunity, again, we have now got a very good memo produced by a legal firm that we commissioned earlier this year. A few weeks ago, they finalized their report, their legal report for us. And the key conclusions of this, we will actually ask them very specifically to look at the implications of our providing county-level geolocations rather than property-level geolocations within the context of EU law. And if you've been following this debate and looking at the program that we've evolved, the one issue, although we deliver against all the objectives, we provide all the data that the EU needs, what we haven't been able to provide and what we actually do not want to provide for all sorts of reasons, which I'll explain later, we've been providing, obviously, county-level geolocations instead of property-level geolocations. And we got the legal firm to look at, is this an appropriate approach within the context of EU law? And the lawyers were very clear, yes, this is a very good approach because it actually avoids conflicts with what they called certain supra-legislative sources of EU law. These include the general principles of proportionality, which are inside the EU constitution, the freedom to conduct a business, the fundamental right to protection of personal data, as well as, of course, international trade law agreements, which are actually binding upon the EU. And particularly important, this is something we've been emphasizing a lot in our communication, is that it also actually means that the EU can maintain the effectiveness of EUDR and the geolocation requirements and ensure that the EUDR actually fulfills its objectives in the context of US hardwoods. If you try to do it at property level, the EUDR actually would not function for US hardwoods. This is the only way you can make the law function for US hardwoods. So this was a very clear recommendation from the legal firm. And we're asking now that the EC clarify in its guidance that a county-level approach is compliant with the EUDR. We also want them to adjust the definition of the plot of land in the law itself. And we think we could actually make this law work much more effectively for everybody, not just US hardwoods, by simply removing the phrase within a single real estate property from the definition of the plot of land for which geolocation data is required. And that would allow them actually to start focusing the plot of land on what we're calling micro-jurisdictions. They're actually counties, of course, in our context, but in other countries, they could focus on small, demonstrating provenance to local authority areas where you can demonstrate very effectively with the current technology that's available, current data that's available, that there's a genuine negligible risk, and then combining that with a proof of provenance system, exactly what we're trying to deliver through the AHA program. And we're saying to them, you can make this change pretty much immediately, because they're all in the EC, they're currently negotiating an omnibus set of laws to simplify their broader environmental requirements. And what we're offering would be a very simple way of making the EUDR work more effectively. So anyway, this is the American Hardwood Assured System. How many of you actually have heard of this program and are engaged in this program? Not a lot of you. That's interesting. So a lot of you haven't really heard of American Hardwood Assured at all. Well, okay, that's interesting. Well, what this is, this is actually a globally applicable assurance mechanism for American hardwoods. It's inspired by the EU Deforestation Regulation. It's not driven by the EUDR at all. We see this as a globally applicable program that can be used to demonstrate that American hardwoods are legal, sustainable, deforestation-free in global markets, voluntary programs wherever they are in the world, legislation anywhere in the world, including, indeed, inside the United States. Ultimately, this could be used for market development in the United States as well. What it is, it's not a certification program. It's actually a geographical identification program. It's basically saying, because this is an American hardwood that comes from this area of the United States, it has these technical attributes, and it also has these very distinct positive environmental attributes. We're selling, it's more like selling champagne than FSC. That's what we're doing. We're selling the best. That's what we're doing. And it's based on where it comes from. There's a very strong focus on forest governance. One of the big strengths of the US hardwood sector in the world market is that there's very good laws, regulations, a whole culture actually in this country which makes sure that illegality is very rare and that deforestation is also very rare in this sector. It works, it's based on an easy and accessible online portal for suppliers. It's much lower cost than certification frameworks. It can be integrated very easily with existing documentary management systems. And it basically works, and you don't have to pay a lot of money for it.
Any money right now?
Well, that's no money right now for at least until the end of next year, and perhaps for longer than that. It uses the latest technology to increase the accuracy and reduce costs. It's based on targeted independent expert risk assessment. It will, next year, we're going to integrate blockchain tracking and plant chemistry-based surveillance into the system. It is initially going to be operated entirely by AHEC, and as we say, free to all, for all US-based hardwood traders. So anybody, you don't have to be an AHEC member, although you're encouraged to be one, but anybody can use this system if they can demonstrate that they have that they're a US hardwood exporting company. And it will be eventually independent. The idea is that this will eventually be rolled off as an independent program, which will be funded probably by a pay-as-you-go volume-based licensing system. And the beauty of that is eventually you can get people who are manufacturing products out of American hardwood in Vietnam, in Turkey, in Europe. If they start using this AHA claim that money can also be used to support this whole program and ultimately be flowed back into active promotion work for American hardwoods worldwide. So essentially it's got 4 elements behind it. There's a deforestation risk assessment, which is undertaken at a county level. Then there's a set of legality risk assessments. They're undertaken at state level. Then there's the web portal, and we've divided development of that web portal into 2 phases. The first phase, which has been implemented, actually it's already up and running. You can sign up now to this portal. This system can be used by exporters to generate standardized due diligence statements. And then the second phase will be to turn that web portal into a whole system for the global supply chain and wood-based, plant chemistry-based wood provenance testing, linking it with blockchain. And this will provide a program which can be used all over the world to make very robust claims about the environmental qualities of American hardwoods. Yeah, I said it's very strongly focused on forest governance. Actually, AHEC has got a very long history of working on things like on risk assessments, jurisdictional risk assessments. Hopefully most of you are familiar with the work that was done on the Seneca Creek risk assessment starting back in 2008, updated in 2017. From that work, we were able to build a framework for jurisdictional legality risk assessment, and we've used that framework as the basis for commissioning 37 state risk assessments, looking at the legality risk. They cover all the risks covered in EUDR across 37 states. And it was undertaken independently by a company called Dovetail, who a lot of you might be familiar with. And what was remarkable about that assessment is across 37 states and across 18 different criteria for illegality, risk, they did not specify one single risk right across the United States hardwood sector. We didn't expect that, but that was the result. And it's based on, literally, there must be 5,000 pages of analysis. They interviewed up to 1,000 people across the United States. And at the end of that process, they did not specify one single illegality risk in this country, which is a real testament to how well you are managing, complying with US hardwood laws. Yes, why county geolocations? I think if you're involved in the US hardwood sector, this will be pretty much obvious to everybody. Providing county level geolocations, it's simply a lot more manageable. There are about 1,500 counties across the US which supply all the saw log supply. Each county is about, I think they average about 160,000 hectares. They each produce, it says here, about 100 cubic meters per year, but actually now it's about 60,000 cubic meters per year, which is actually about the same sort of size as a large concession area in the tropics or a large industrial plantation. So it's actually a very homogeneous area where you can assess risk very accurately, and it's much more manageable than trying to provide data on individual properties.
Rupert.
Yep.
Keep it higher level. We need to move.
We need to move on.
The main.
Yeah. Anyway, just to mention the deforestation risk analysis, it was prepared using the USDA crop data layer. We're going to do this. It's going to be updated every single year. There's a very sophisticated algorithm for checking what the changes in forest extent at a county level. And just to give you the high-level results from that particular deforestation risk assessment, we can say with absolute certainty for every 10,000 cubic meters of US hardwood saw logs harvested each year, only 1 cubic meter is on land potentially converted to agriculture. I think it's a risk of 0.001%, which I think, again, we can confirm that it's negligible risk by any normal definition of that term. The platform itself, we can demonstrate it to you. We have been demonstrating it to you at our booth at the show. I think that if anybody hasn't seen it yet and you have a desperate need to want to see it now, you can go and do that. But otherwise, just contact us. We can certainly give you a demonstration. The idea behind this platform is it's very intuitive. It's a simple point-of-click system. The idea is you can, for each individual consignment, you can bring together the data from the deforestation risk assessment with the legality risk assessment and data that you enter on the counties from which consignments are derived. You only have to prepare these hardwood supply area templates for the county. You can prepare that once a year and use that continuously for the consignments. And then you enter all the data on the product groups which you're exporting in the consignment. And that's what it looks like. It's a AHA statement. It provides, incidentally, all the data that's required for EUDR. It includes things like the harmonized code for the product groups, both the US export code and the international code and the EU code. It sets out exactly the counties from which the hardwood in that consignment is derived, and it also provides a button where your customers can download the geolocation data, the list of counties in the format that is actually required by EUDR. We have been, some of you have already been supplying these statements to importers. We're already getting, and we've actually talked to a lot of importers directly. They're already saying inside the EU, yeah, this is exactly what we need. It does actually fulfill all our obligations under the EUDR. So we're actually pretty confident that at a practical level, at an importer level, these statements will be and already are actually being accepted. And then the next phase, I don't want to go into detail on this, but the next phase that we will be working on next year is to develop this proof of provenance concept, to turn this from a simple system for exporters into a global proof of provenance system. And this will essentially package all the data that's in the due diligence statements into a block, what we call a genesis block, which can then be passed through the blockchain to the end consumer right the way through the global market. We won't be specifying or saying that companies throughout that chain have to comply with a specific chain of custody standard. It will all be operated through the online platform and linked with a system to ensure the integrity of the system. And this system will be based very much on random samples of products in the marketplace, and they will be linking those products to specific provenance by testing using plant chemistry-based techniques like stable isotope ratio analysis, like trace element analysis. And this is going to be a big part of what we're going to be doing over the next few months. One thing we do want to engage with the industry very directly with is gathering timber samples, because to deliver this program and to demonstrate and prove provenance, ultimately we will need a good database of timber samples from right across the US hardwood supply area. So I can talk to you directly about that if you're interested, but we very much want support in helping us gather these samples. It's simply a matter of going into the forest with a borer, selecting, identifying the species, identifying the precise location of those trees in the forest, putting that together and sending that off to a central point where all that data will be collated and sent to a lab. And using that process, we will have a database that we can use to check wood product provenance just using the plant chemistry based procedures. I'm not going to go into details. There's basically two ways we could do this, but again, if you're interested, I'm happy to explain that to you later on. Any questions? We'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Sorry to rush through it at the end.
So it's about 2 o'clock, but are there any questions?
Rupert, what does this mean for log exports, value-added doors, and other commodity exports into the EUDR 2?
Have I got a...
Yeah, you're on with you.
Oh, you can hear me. Yeah, this covers all products. Actually, we launched it. We did a sort of soft launch at the beginning of August, where we were focusing very much on the products exported by AHEC members. So it was lumber, logs, veneers, and moldings. But one of the things that is actually will be updated, I think we're almost ready to push the button on it. It will allow people to produce these statements for all the product groups in Chapter 44. So everything right the way up through flooring, joinery products, the whole works will be. You can use this framework to deliver things into the EUD market and into the global market. Yeah,
And so can their customers.
all hardwoods. Yeah, sorry.
And so can their customers.
Well, it's got to be entered on this side. It's
Yeah.
US customers.
yes.
Yeah.
Just as a comment, I got in on the early end of this in August and provided the hot off the press certificates through your system to several customers in Europe, and they were elated.
Great.
They really were. They were saying, this is exactly what we need. And we think, we don't know what the hell the EU will do as far as whether this will be the final acceptable format, but we can't imagine that it will be far different from this. They were very, very happy.
Yeah, which is always encouraging if the customers inside the EU are already accepting it. I think and the important thing is that as many people as possible deliver these statements, irrespective of whether the EUDR has been implemented. We want to get this, so it basically becomes a fait accompli. This is what you get from the US hardwood sector. This delivers against all the requirements of EUDR, delivers against all the objectives of EUDR, and it really will help us push the case for this being accepted and written into the formal guidance. Yes.
So that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Let's
Yeah.
use,
Yeah.
all of us that are exporting to Europe that have to have EUDR statements anyway, just go ahead and run these for
Yeah.
each of the consignments, each one of the shipments. And as you said, they'll say like, here's what we've got, it's exactly what you wanted. It might not be in the exact format you guys finally fool around and come up with, but this will work.
Yeah.
And like you said, they'll have to accept it.
And I think that's going to be the big advantage of if there is an additional year law, because that's going to give us that time to work with the European authorities and say, essentially what we're doing is we're handing them a solution to what they realize is a big problem of implementation. And we're handing them a very credible, data-driven solution on a silver platter.
It's you guys that came up with it, and I'm proud.
This is gonna be more for Michael and or Tripp. How much investment in terms of AHEC is made from the sawmill versus log exporters? Can you give me that data, or do you?
Well, no, we have a lot of members that do both.
And I realize that.
Yeah.
Do you know how much is just from a log
No.
export company?
No. I mean, a lot of the companies that are specifically log exporters, we don't have many of them in AHEC, because again, they feel that we don't do enough to assist them in exporting
Which is
logs.
damn good. I don't like log exports anyway.
As I said, I think the fact that both sides are mad at us, I think means we're in the right place on that.
When is the date that this will be confirmed?
The EUDR, if it is pushed back, it'll be December 30th, 2026. And it's very likely that it is. It's been recommended, but there's not, Parliament needs to meet and stamp it.
Yeah, it might be like last year where they didn't actually come to an agreement with, until 2 days before it was meant to be. It could be as late as that, but we hope not. We hope not.
And I think from a practical perspective, even if for some reason the European Parliament, for political reasons, say, we're not going to delay it, from practical perspective, they can't implement it. They already know that the amount of data they're asking for is going to crash their system.
Yeah.
Do you remember the specific name of the act where, the EU cannot enact a law that they cannot themselves meet and apply it to their trading partners? What is,
I don't know, but that's something worth looking at. Yeah.
Reciprocity.
within their own
Yeah.
charter?
Well, and technically, we have the same thing, because under the Lacey Act, in the U.S., anybody who's supplying wood into the U.S. has to abide by all of their own legal requirements. So if having this proof of provenance and listing all of these individual harvest sites is required for wood going into the EU, then under the Lacey Act, then it's the same thing should be required for EU exports to the United States.
Yeah.
Now, the US is not anywhere near wanting to implement that, but I think that is something that can be held up. I don't want to say as a, as a bludgeon, but that is something that can be very much a part of the negotiations between the US government and the EU.
Yeah.
As at the end of the day, the EU on wood products exports a lot more to the US than we export to them. So they have more to lose than we do on this.
Olive oil, it could be the Valencia oranges, it could be roses from the Canary Islands, it could be,
Let's stick with long. Question for Mike on clarity on the budget issue, for the clarity. The little piece across the top that was in light green that showed U.S. Company participation.
Yes.
Industry participation. Was that just dues you were showing?
That was dues.
Okay.
That was dues.
And I think it's important that the room knows that that's just dues, and it's important that we fill out the company-specific, what we spend on exports, because that comes as part of what industry continues. And I think we'd be remiss if you didn't explain that just a little bit while we're here.
Yeah. Yeah, no, there's two aspects of it. As I said, part of it is, we're bringing in right now in dues in the neighborhood of $600,000 a year. We're bringing in with dues. Which is used, well, for domestic administration, because the USDA funds can't be used for our domestic administration. So, my salary, the AHEC office, TRIP, our finance people, our accounting people, that all has to be paid for by the industry. But even just as importantly, well, not more importantly than our salaries, of course, but equally importantly, I think, is the fact that we need that, we need to have that, that cash in order to, as I said, we have to do all these programs to pay the satellite system, company that's providing the satellite data for us, to pay the companies that are doing things for us, to pay for overseas trade shows. We have to outlay all that money first, collect all of the backup documentation, submit that to the USDA, and then they return the money to us further down the road. And right now, we're in a situation where with almost $12 million in US government money, and $600,000 coming in, we're trying to cycle basically $1 million a month through our books with essentially a $600,000 operating budget. And that's creating some huge problems, and it's become worse because with the DOGE cuts earlier in the year, the USDA staff has essentially been halved. And whereas previously, we would submit a claim between anywhere from 3 to 6 days, we would be reimbursed. Now we're looking at 2 to 3 weeks between reimbursements. And that can create real problems when we have, trade show booths that we need to pay for, people waiting to be, vendors waiting to be paid overseas. And it's an issue that as an industry, if we want to continue to get the funding from the USDA, we have to find a way to leverage it with industry funds. And right now we're failing in that.
System now. You guys have done a great job.
Yep.
Like we would pay, I'm already paying to go to the EUDR every day, right?
Yeah.
Because we wanted to be compliant. This is much easier, much less cumbersome. We're huge supporters. But we would pay for this now because it wouldn't cost us any more money if that would help with the cash flow.
We anything that's produced with USDA money, we can't receive compensation for. We can't. So, so once the idea is that we're getting right now from the USDA, essentially the seed money to get this program up and running. But within the next 2 years, it's going to need to be spun off if it's going to continue. So we're trying to build enough momentum where this can stand on its own and essentially come off the USDA's books as a standalone program. But we as AHEC, we cannot benefit in any way from that financially.
Mike, I want to be sure I understood what Dean was asking or saying. So anything we spend money on that's related to export within our company, is considered a contribution.
Right. There's two parts. One is obviously the dues, the money that comes in, which is the actual cash, but also the USDA has a requirement, what they call industry contribution. And that's not necessarily money. That's money that you guys spend to do your own export promotion. So what it costs you to do trade shows overseas, what it costs you to pay your export sales staff. Essentially, what the USDA wants to know is that the industry has blood in the game. You know, you're putting your own resources towards exporting, not just waiting for the USDA to fund everything. And those are really important because if we don't match, we have a requirement for every dollar we get from the USDA, we've got to come up with show that the industry is spending at least 60 cents. So when we send you at the end of the year these contribution forms, it's extremely important that people fill them out because that's, you know, we can lose our funding. If we fall short, we can not only lose future funding, we can be asked to pay back money that they've already given us.
Okay, we're at 2:11. We'll take this one last question.
The requirements are coming from the EU for us to play in the game. And it's our financial stake that we have to, is there contribution coming back from the EU? Is there grants coming back from, we're on our own to just supply them?
Yeah.
The data.
Yeah.
How did that get started? Who didn't stop it?
Yeah.
It's our cost.
We could ask them for the money.
I mean,
They
yeah.
do say they're going to support these programs overseas, but yeah, there's very little coming.
Yeah. No, it's just they put that in as a regulation, and it's up to the, you know, at the end of the day, it's the EU importer who's on the line if there's a problem. You as an exporter, you're not exposed legally within the EU unless you have some kind of a contractual agreement with your customer. It is the placer on the market, so it's the importer in the EU that's legally liable for completing these, this regulation. It's not the exporter. It's the importer in the EU.
Okay. Thank you, Mike and Rupert, for all that information. If you would, scan the QR code before you leave, just so we can get that feedback, and thank you all so much.